We are in John, the 8th chapter, I believe, is where we left off last time. I think we left off possibly at verse 40. Correct me if I'm wrong. I believe that's where we are, verse 40 of chapter 8. Right in the midst of Jesus talking to a group of Jews which believed on Him. Notice verse 31. Jesus said to those Jews which believed on Him, "If you continue in my word, then are you my disciples indeed, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." That sparked their response about never being in bondage to any man, which was a laugh when you think about it, because they had been in bondage. And they were now even at this moment in bondage to Rome. They weren't completely free. There was a short period of time during the Maccabean revolt where they were truly independent from any outside force. That didn't last long. Even though Judas Maccabeus was very successful in throwing off the Grecian yoke and the Syrian yoke, the Romans came in and changed the whole ball game. And so they were constantly attacked, in fact, by the Syrians, and then also by the forces from the south. They were constantly bombarded from the north and the south for a long period of time until the Maccabean family worked out an agreement with the Romans, and then the Romans slowly began to tighten their grip over the entire region until by the time you come the first century, the Romans had their procurator in place firmly. Pontius Pilate at this point was a procurator of Judea, and the Romans had a firm grip on things. And so when they said that, "We have never been in bondage to any man," in verse 33, they're completely ignoring their own history and the situation as it stood at that very moment. And what Jesus is talking about is not physical freedom, not freedom concerning from any outside empires or outside nations. He's talking about spiritual freedom, which they cannot, it seems, perceive. He goes on to explain what he says there in verses 34 through 37. And then he segues into verse 39. "They answered and said, Abraham is our father. Jesus saith unto them, If you were Abraham's children, you would do the works of Abraham." I find that phrase very, very fascinating. The works of Abraham. Quite often our religious friends will point to Abraham as an example of someone who obtained justification by faith alone. It is true that Abraham is the father of the faithful, no question about it. He is highlighted prominently in Hebrews chapter 11. But what's overlooked quite often is the fact that James talks about him in James chapter 2 and uses him as an example of faith and works. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he had offered up Isaac his son upon the altar? So you've either got the Bible contradicting itself, or you've got a fact of the works that James is speaking of, and here the works that Jesus is speaking of are a different kind of works. Remember Ephesians 2, 8, and 9 says, "For by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, not of works, lest any man should boast." Now the works that we see described there in Ephesians 2, 8, and 9 are the works by which we can earn or deserve, merit salvation. No one in this room, no one on this earth has ever or will ever earn salvation. No one can. It's impossible to do it. Not one person can deserve the salvation that God gives. There's not one person that can say that. And if they do, they're either completely misguided or they're lying, because the Bible doesn't teach that. You don't earn salvation. You can earn a spot on a football team. You can earn promotions where you work. You can earn a lot of things in this life, that is to say, in business and in sports and in many other things. But there's one thing you cannot earn, and that's the salvation that God gives. Now, what does that mean? That means that the works that James talks about in James 2 and the works that Jesus is talking about here in John 8 are a different kind of works. What kind of works are they? I would submit to you quite candidly and forthrightly that the works that Jesus is speaking of and the works that James is talking about are works of obedience, which are a completely different kind of work. When we obey the Lord, when we simply obey what God has told us to do, we can never once say that because of our obedience we then merit the salvation that God gives. No one can say that. So what does the relationship of works have to do with salvation? If you look at salvation not only as a gift, but also as it's described in Hebrews as a will, a last will and testament, then it comes into clarity a little bit further. In a will and testament, you have a gift to be given or gifts to be given by the testator. You also have conditions that are placed upon those gifts, do you not? Certain requirements must be met. Certain conditions must be met. When those conditions are met and the gift is given, can one say that he or she has earned that gift? No, not once. But in order to receive that gift, the conditions must be met. Or, as our preachers have done over the years, if I were to say, he who believes and is baptized shall receive $1 million, would anyone have any difficulty or understanding that statement? Now, I don't have $1 million to give, so don't get excited. But if I were to say, he who believes and is baptized shall receive $1 million, there's not one person that would misunderstand what to do to receive that gift. But yet, when it comes to salvation, when we say, he who believes and is baptized shall be saved, oh no, baptism has nothing to do with it. You want to exclude baptism. Why? Because it's a work. Well, it's not a work because you're not doing anything, you're passive. Yes, but it's a work. Well, just because you say it's a work doesn't make it a work. Jesus said, in response to a question, as we've seen in our study, what shall we do that we may work the works of God? Jesus said, this is the work of God that you believe on Him whom He hath sent. So if you're going to really be strict about the language, and if you're going to be really particular about it, then those who teach salvation by faith alone are teaching salvation by works. Are they not? Isn't that what Jesus said? Well, now look at the context here. Jesus is speaking to those Jews who believed on Him, verse 31. And it's quite obvious that they're not willing to go further than simply believe on Him and do something about it. Thus, talking about the fact, if you were Abraham's children, you would do the works of Abraham. Now, the Hebrews writer explains to us that Abraham had faith. But he also demonstrated that faith through works. What kind of works? Obedience. You go all the way back to the day of Noah. Genesis chapter 6. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. First time the word grace or something akin to it will ever be found in the Bible. Was that right there in Genesis 6? Noah found grace, unmerited favor is another definition of that Hebrew phrase. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. He didn't earn it. He didn't deserve it. He found it. So then God extended that grace to Noah in the form of a law or instructions that were given. He told him to go build an ark. And He told him the specific instructions connected with that ark. And then what does Moses say at the very end of Genesis 6? Thus did Noah. According to all that God commanded him, so did he. So you've got grace in Genesis 6, you've got a law in Genesis 6, and you've got works in Genesis 6. And Noah is mentioned in the heroes of faith in Hebrews 11. Abraham had that same kind of faith. He had an obedient faith. When he was told to go into a place which he should have to receive for an inheritance, he obeyed. Notice that. The Hebrews writer specifically says he obeyed, and he went out not knowing whither he went. He obeyed the command of the Lord. He didn't deserve that land. He didn't deserve that gift that God was giving him, but God told him to go, and he went. That's the kind of works of Abraham that Jesus is speaking of here in verse 39. Then he goes on, verse 40. But now you seek to kill me, a man that hath told you the truth, which I have heard of God. This did not Abraham. In other words, you belie your claim. Your works are disproving your claim. Your works are completely opposite Abraham. Abraham didn't do anything that you're doing, and yet you're claiming to be his descendants. Verse 41, you do the deeds of your father. He's setting them up. Notice this. Jesus is setting them up beautifully. Then said they to him, we be not born of fornication. We have one Father, even God. You see, now they're beginning to see a little bit the spiritual nature of Jesus' remarks here. But they're not seeing completely what he's talking about. Jesus said unto them, if God were your Father, you would love me. For I proceeded forth and came from God. Neither came I of myself, but he sent me. Jesus here in a roundabout fashion is indicating to them that his origin was different from any other. Even though he does not explicitly say anything about his virgin conception here, he implies it clearly. He implies it clearly. Why do you not understand my speech? Even because you cannot hear my word. Now, obviously, they were hearing Jesus. They were hearing him speak. What does he mean by you cannot hear my word? They cannot understand it. They don't want to understand it. Hearing is an interesting word used in the New Testament, and it carries along with it a variety of meanings. You have the word hear in the sense of hearing a sound. You have the word hear in the sense of understanding. In this context, Jesus is clearly indicating that they are not understanding him. You cannot hear or understand my word. You don't understand my speech, verse 43, because you cannot hear my word. They refuse to understand. In other words, there's a refusal there. They don't want to understand. You are of your father, the devil. Here he goes. And the lust of your father you will do. He was a murderer from the beginning, and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh of his own, for he is a liar, and the father of it. Jesus never offended anybody. Look at that verse and tell me he didn't offend these people when he said that. He absolutely offended these people when he said this. And it was deliberate. It was deliberate because he wanted them to be shaken up to the point where they had to do something. They either had to choose to follow him or choose not to follow him. Sometimes direct talk, direct speech is needed to get through to someone who is obstinately refusing to listen up to this point. Jesus just tells them, your father is the devil. Boy, that would get their attention quickly. They hated Jesus. They hated Jesus to the point that they wanted to take his life. And in that sense, they were just like the devil. The devil wanted Jesus dead. He wanted him gone. He wanted him out of the picture. And these spiritual offsprings of Satan are willing, quite willing, to accomplish that. And notice what Jesus says about the devil. That's a very interesting description that he gives there. We, of course, don't have a detailed description of the origin of the devil. A lot of that is people have speculation about how he originated. We go to Ezekiel and other Old Testament passages talking about Lucifer, and there are those that say that's where you find, well, it may be. He's talking about the king of Tyrus there. Tyre. He's not really talking about the devil, even though I believe that possibly he's referring to the origin of the devil. But having said that, even though we don't have an explicit statement that clearly spells out how the devil came to be, Jesus very, very strongly talks about him here. He is the devil, diabolos, Diabolou is the word that's used in the Greek verse here. Diabolos, where we get our word diabolical. That's where we get the word diabolical. Diabolos, your father the devil, the lust of your father you will do. Notice, he was a murderer from the beginning. The beginning of what? The beginning, I would contend, of his origin. At his origin. In other words, the devil, I do not believe the devil is a being that has no beginning and has no end like God, the Father. There are some who teach that among us. And I understand the reason why they teach it is because they want to get away from the possibility of God creating evil. Well, God did not create evil. If you believe that Satan was a created being at the very beginning as the other angels, then the devil originated sin himself. God didn't originate that in him. Now there comes the question then, well, when did the angels choose or have the choice to follow God or not follow God? We're not told that. That's speculation once again. But it's interesting that he says he was a murderer from the beginning and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. From the very start, Satan decided to not follow God. Whatever his origin was, his choice was to not follow God. Now, how do I know that Satan is not on an equal plane with God? Because you notice in Job, the 1st and 2nd chapter, Satan appears with the sons of God before God's presence. Now, there's a difference of opinion as to is that in heaven or is that on earth? I used to believe that that was in heaven. I do not believe that now. I believe that's on earth. I believe that Satan disguised himself among the sons of God, those that were worshiping God, and presented himself among those sons of God. And then when they left, he was only one left, and he had this conversation with the Lord. But at any rate, notice that God allows Satan to affect Job. He allows him to take away everything he's got. Then he allows Satan to affect Job physically, but he places one restriction on him. You can't take his life. Question: if Satan was and is an eternal being like God with no beginning and no end, if he is omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent evil, as God is omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent good, then how could God the Father restrict Satan from killing Job? How? Because those of our brethren that say that Satan, is eternal evil as God is eternal good, say that Satan's power was then limited when Jesus died on the cross. Satan played his trump card when he crucified Jesus, but then Jesus' resurrection crushed the power of Satan. Okay, if Satan's power had not been crushed prior to the resurrection, then how could God place restriction upon Satan to not take Job's life? You see, that undermines, I believe, that teaching. But we're getting away off of this. I just want to make that observation. Still, back here on the verse, when he speaketh the lie, he speaketh of his own. In other words, he originated this. For he is a liar and the father of it. Satan is the originator of all lies, is what Jesus is saying. And he's telling these Jews, you are exactly like him in what you're doing, in promoting lies and in not following me. And because I tell you the truth, verse 45, you believe me not. Now wait a minute. In verse 31, Jesus is said to be talking to those Jews who believed on him. And now here in verse 45, he says, you believe me not. Have they all of a sudden changed? No. What is he talking about? He's talking about, in context, the fact that they are not willing to obey him. They're not willing to follow him, to take the next step, to submit their will to his. They believe on him. They believe who he is. But just because they believe on him doesn't mean they're willing to follow him. Now, you see the implications of that for today? There's a lot of people that believe in Jesus Christ as the Son of God today. A lot of people, still, in our day and time. But there's a lot of people among that number who are not willing to do what Jesus said. They believe on Him, but they're not willing to take the next step. That's what Jesus is getting at. Verse 46, which of you convinceth me of sin? And if I say the truth, why do you not believe me? What He says must be true. In other words, if you cannot accuse me and make it stick that I have sinned or am in sin, then why don't you believe me? He that is of God heareth God's words. Hearing in the sense of receiving, accepting, doing. You therefore hear them not because you are not of God. They're hearing Him. Their auditory, their ears are fine as far as hearing the sounds and hearing the words. They're not willing to receive it. Then answered the Jews and said unto him, say we not well that thou art a Samaritan and hast a devil? Well, you know, here you go. When you can't answer someone's arguments, what do? You resort to slander. You resort to name-calling. He had just devastated their claims. And yet they say, well, you're a Samaritan. You got a demon. Jesus answered, I have not a devil. But I honor my Father, and you do dishonor me. And I seek not mine own glory. There is one that seeketh and judgeth. Notice, please, Jesus did not lose His cool. That's one thing that strikes me about our Lord more than anything else. Jesus on occasion got angry. We have explicit statements in the gospel records where Jesus got angry on occasion. But in this kind of discussion where people are throwing insults at Him, Jesus did not lose His cool. That's something that all of us need to learn from. When you are involved in a religious discussion with someone, and that person gets upset because of the things that you're trying to convey, as long as you're not being mean and boisterous or vindictive, if you're just simply trying to teach someone the truth and they get mad at you and they start throwing invective at you, keep your cool. You need to keep your cool. Because if you lose your cool, you've lost the argument. Jesus kept His cool right here. And notice, He indicates that He doesn't mind people slinging insults at Him. He doesn't mind abuse. He says, I seek not my own glory. I'm not in it to glorify myself. There is one, the Father, that seeketh and judgeth. I'm going to leave it up to Him. I'm going to leave the judging up to my heavenly Father. Verily, verily, I say unto you, if a man keep my saying, he shall never see death. Well, here we go. Now Jesus is beginning to really pinpoint what He's talking about. If you keep my saying, that's obey, is it not? Keeping Jesus' saying is doing what He says. You shall never see death. Notice it's conditional. Those of our religious neighbors who want to say that once you're saved, you're always saved, that if you have it, you never lose it, and if you lost it, you never had it, that if you are saved, you're as bound for heaven as a marten is to its gourd, and nothing can turn you off from that. They've got to deal with this. Jesus puts a condition on it. If, that word if is the largest word in the New Testament. Have you ever thought about that? 2 letters in the English language. If. If a man keep my saying, he shall never see death. Now what's the opposite? If you don't keep Jesus' saying, you will see death spiritually. It's just that simple. It's so simple, we'd have to have help to misunderstand it. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people that are having help to misunderstand what Jesus says. Verse 52, then said the Jews unto Him, now we know that you've got a devil. You have a devil. Oh, really? You know that for certainty. Abraham is dead, and the prophets. And thou sayest, if a man keep my saying, he shall never taste of death. Art thou greater than our father Abraham, which is dead? And the prophets are dead. Whom makest thou thyself? In other words, who are you to say that you're greater than Abraham and the prophets? That's what they're saying. They are saying that God's word was spoken to Abraham and the prophets and had not preserved lives. Yet you claim greater power for your words. How can you do that? Jesus answered, "If I honor myself, my honor is nothing. It is my Father that honoreth me, of whom you say that He is your God." You see, here He's making plain that He refers to God as Father. "Yet you have not known Him." That is to say, they have not known God to the point that they're willing to completely change. That's the kind of knowledge that He's referring to. "But I know Him." Now, the knowledge that Jesus is speaking about is not just the fact that He's willing to do what God says. Obviously He is. He has direct, personal knowledge of God the Father that no one else could have. No one else could ever have. "And if I should say I know Him not, I shall be a liar like unto you. But I know Him and keep His saying." There you go. He says, I not only keep my Father's saying, I know Him. I know Him. A direct, personal, intimate knowledge of the Father. "Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad." Wow. Think about that statement for a moment that Jesus makes here. Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. Could that be Abraham saw Jesus' day by faith? Possibly. Or is Jesus referring to the fact that Abraham was allowed by God to see the coming of Jesus Christ directly? Possibly. If that is the case, then it is not recorded in Scripture. Remember what John is going to say at the end of his gospel. "Many other signs that Jesus do in the presence of His disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you might believe." There's a lot of things that are connected with the life of Jesus that we don't have any record of, written record. We're limited to just a certain period of time during Jesus' 3.5 years of ministry. So if what Jesus is talking about is Abraham in paradise being allowed to see the coming of Jesus and allowed to see some at least of His works, then it's something that is not recorded in Scripture. But at any rate, that's a fascinating verse to me. He saw it, past tense. Abraham already saw this and was glad. Abraham now realizes this is the fulfillment of all those promises that God made to me in the long ago. In Genesis chapter 12, when He said, "All nations of the earth shall be blessed through your seed." Now he understands totally what God was meaning by that. "Then said the Jews unto him, Thou art not yet 50 years old, and hast thou seen Abraham?" Jesus at this moment was about 33 years of age, the best we can tell. 33 years old. He said, "Have you seen Abraham?" Here's the kicker. Jesus said unto them, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am." Now, you don't think they didn't see the implications of that statement right quick? You better believe they did. Because remember in Exodus chapter 3, when Moses is before the burning bush, and God tells him to tell the Egyptians, "I am that I am has sent you." Oh, they see the implications of this. Before Abraham was, I am. Jesus is thus claiming deity for Himself. Then took they up stones to cast at Him. They think He's blaspheming. But Jesus hid Himself and went out of the temple, going to the midst of them, and so passed by. Now, the American Standard Version omits that last phrase, going through the midst of them and so passed by. But at any rate, at the very least, he hid himself. How did he hide himself? We don't know. He could have physically, literally hid himself, or, as I believe, he likely used his miraculous powers to hide himself so they could not stone him. This was not the time to do this. This was not the circumstance in which this must be done. What really is amazing to me, it's amazing that after this exchange happens, and after they try to kill him at this moment, it's amazing to me that Jesus continued to try to teach these people. He continued on to try to teach them, to try to get through to them. Sometimes you've got to have immense patience to teach someone, and stick-to-itiveness. Even though Jesus would not succeed in the vast majority of these cases in convincing them and converting them to the truth. The Sanhedrin, except for Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, would be vehemently opposed to Jesus. Still, he tried to teach them. That's fascinating. Well, we come into chapter 9, and the events of chapter 9, well known to us, happen about the Feast of Tabernacles, possibly in October, or possibly the Feast of Dedication, which would put it in December. Not certain exactly the exact time frame of this. Somewhere between October and December, the two marks, two posts, if you want to put it that way. It's either the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Dedication. So chapter 9 says, as Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from his birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? That's a pretty harsh thing to say, isn't it? But think about it for a moment. Isn't that still an all too common thought for those who have some sort of debilitating disease that they've had all their life? Well, there must have been something going on. No, not necessarily. Yes, there are things that result because of sinful practices, no question. But just because someone has some kind of debilitating disease or some kind of malady doesn't mean that there's any sin involved. Jesus says this explicitly in verse 3. Jesus answered, Neither hath this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. In other words, this blindness that this man has had from birth is going to redound to the glory of God. It is for a special reason that this person has this blindness. That the works of God should be made manifest in him. I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night cometh when no man can work. After Jesus' resurrection, he would do no miracles of healing. In other words, he's got to take care of all these things while he is still among them. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. When he had thus spoken, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay. Now, why did Jesus do this? Why did he just not tell him, you are healed? Well, there's a lot of speculation as to why. Possibly to aid this blind man's faith. Possibly to emphasize to everyone that witnessed it, this man's condition, that this wasn't simply a parlor trick. They knew this man. They knew he'd been blind from birth. And what Jesus does here is to emphasize that, possibly. Or it could be that in connection with this man's blindness, there was some sort of inflammation, some sort of irritation around the eyes. And if that's the case, then possibly Jesus made this clay of spittle and put it on this man's eyes to heal the inflammation first, and then to take care of the blindness later. Which is personally what I think was going on here. Jesus was trying to take care of whatever was around his eyes, and then he would be healed after that of his blindness. And said unto him, Go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is by interpretation sent. He went his way, therefore, and washed, and came seeing. Now notice, please, when was he healed of his blindness? He was healed of his blindness after he did what Jesus told him to do. Go wash in the pool of Siloam. He went, washed, and came seeing. And that's the simple process. That's what Jesus tells him to do. The neighbors, therefore, and they which before had seen him that he was blind, said, Is not this he that sat and begged? Some said, This is he. Others said, He is like him. But he said, I am he. Now this indicates to me not only the confusion of the people. Is this the actual person that sat and begged? Well, he looks like him. That indicates to me that there was something going on around his eyes that obscured how he actually looked. In other words, what Jesus did when he made that clay of spittle was to heal that inflammation, which would change his appearance. And then, of course, when he received his sight, he could see, but his appearance had changed somewhat. Therefore said they unto him, How were thine eyes opened? He answered and said, A man that is called Jesus made clay and anointed mine eyes, and said unto me, Go to the pool of Siloam and wash. And I went and washed, and I received sight. Simple. Now, according to many of our religious friends, what he should have said was, A man that is called Jesus made clay and anointed mine eyes and said to me, Go to the pool of Siloam and wash. And I told the Lord, You know what, Lord? My eyes already feel better. I don't think I need to go down that pool of Siloam. I don't see any reason why I should bathe in that pool of Siloam. I don't see any purpose. No, that's not what he said. He should have said, Well, I don't see any connection between washing in the pool of Siloam and receiving sight. That's not what he said. He said, I went and washed and I received sight. There's people today that say, I don't see any connection between baptism and salvation. I don't see any use. I feel like I'm saved. I just know in my heart that I'm saved. Jesus still says, He who believes and is baptized shall be saved. Well, I don't believe that. Well, you've got to deal with the Lord. The Lord said it. Now, are you going to do what He said or not? This blind man did what the Lord said. Then said they unto him, Where is he? He said, I know not. They brought to the Pharisees him that aforetime was blind, and it was the Sabbath day, which when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Again, the question of the Sabbath arises. It's a legal question now in the eyes of the Pharisees. Then again the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. He said unto them, He put clay upon mine eyes, and I washed, and do see. He told them no more than what he had told his friends who didn't know if that was really him. Therefore said some of the Pharisees, This man is not of God, because he keepeth not the Sabbath day. Others said, How can a man that is a sinner do such miracles? And there was a division among them. There was a division among the Pharisees as to the error, as they saw it, of Jesus violating the Sabbath. Then they say unto the blind man again, What sayest thou of him that he hath opened thine eyes? What do you say? He said, He is a prophet. He doesn't know anything more about Jesus than that. But the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight, until they called the parents of him that had received his sight. We don't really believe he's been blind. So they call in his parents. And they asked him, saying, Is this your son, who you say was born blind? Notice that little snide remark. You say was born blind? How then doth he now see? His parents answered them and said, We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind, but by what means he now seeth we know not, or who hath opened his eyes we know not. He is of age, ask him, he shall speak for himself. That strikes me as funny every time I read it, even though they were scared to death. His parents were scared to death. As John says here in verse 22, these words spake his parents because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had agreed already that if any man did confess he was Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. Therefore said his parents, He is of age, ask him. Still, when they say, He's of age, ask him, he can speak for himself. They're not willing to accept the truth, these Pharisees. Then again called they the man that was blind, said unto him, Give God the praise. We know that this man is a sinner. In other words, give God the praise, not Jesus. We know that Jesus is a sinner. We know that he is a sinner. How? They can't, because he's not. He answered and said, Whether he be a sinner or no, I know not. One thing I know, that whereas I was blind, now I see. He said, I only know one thing. I was blind, now I see. This exchange gets farcical here in a moment. Watch this. Then said they unto him again, what did he to thee? How opened he thine eyes? He answered them, I have told you already, and you did not hear. Wherefore would you hear it again? Will you also be his disciples? This guy's getting bold. This blind man whose eyes Jesus were open, he is standing before the Sanhedrin that has his life in their hands. And he says, I told you once, and you didn't listen. Will you be his disciples? I'll tell you again if you need it. Then they reviled him and said, thou art his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spake unto Moses, for as this fellow, we know not from whence he is. They still don't get it. Now watch this. This is beautiful. The man answered and said unto him, why, herein is a marvelous thing that you know not from whence he is, and yet he hath opened mine eyes. This guy is bold. Whoever he was, and he's not ever named by John. And I have my own personal conviction as to who this man possibly was, even though I won't say it. Still, whoever this man was, he was bold enough to stick it to the Pharisees here. Here is a marvelous thing that you know not from whence he is, and yet he hath opened my eyes. Now we know that God heareth not sinners, but if any man be a worshiper of God and doeth his will, him he heareth. Since the world began, was it not heard that any man opened the eyes of one that was born blind? If this man were not of God, he could do nothing. Boy, he's hitting it. He's hitting it on all cylinders at this moment. He's got it pegged. Now, I'm not going to deal with the question today of what he brings up in verse 31 about does God hear sinners. I'm going to talk about that next week, even though I've got a definitive conclusion about this. He's not contradicting the Old Testament, I will say that. He's not contradicting what the Old Testament scriptures say, and so the Pharisees don't contradict him on this, which gives us a clue. But still, verses 32 and 33, he says, we don't know of any kind of healing that's like what he did to me. It stands alone as a marvel. They answered and said unto him, thou wast altogether born in sins, and dost thou teach us? And they cast him out. In other words, they say, you are blind because you were in sin or your parents were in sin. Just like the disciples had asked before. So they cast him out of the synagogue. Jesus heard they cast him out, and when he had found him, he said unto him, dost thou believe on the Son of God? Jesus had heard about what happened. He answered and said, who is he, Lord, that I might believe on him? Tell me. And Jesus said unto him, thou hast both seen him, and it is he that talketh with thee. So as we end this, we find that to the outcast of the synagogue here in John 9, and to the outcast Samaritan, all the way back in John chapter 4, Jesus fully reveals himself. That's fascinating to me. He said, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped him. Well, this is where we'll stop for today. And we will resume our study next week, and we'll talk about verse 31 a little bit at the very first, and then we'll resume chapter 9.